again this month. So when Deborah asked me to do this talk, she did send me the sort of theme for this week. I guess for this month, it's divine discomfort, which is kind of a strange phrase. I'd never heard those two words put together either. But the whole idea of working with discomfort or pain, and there's a phrase in particular that's with this week, pain, whether physical or emotional, can serve as a powerful catalyst for change and action. So what I want to talk about today, of course, my talk is about turning arrows into flowers, how we work with pain, suffering, difficulty, problems, and see something in them that we can extract that allows us to transform them, to make them into something quite beneficial. And in Tibetan Buddhism, which is what I teach, we have wonderful techniques for working with this, and I'm going to share a bit of that with you today. But I want to just talk in general about how this is nothing unique to Buddhism. This whole concept of being able to transform something that is usually difficult for us into something very rich and powerful is taught in all spiritual traditions. Many years ago, I was reading a book by Mark Ian Barish called Field Notes on the Compassionate Life. And I grew up Catholic, and so this particularly resonated with me, and I actually met Brother David Standelrast once before. But he's quoted in this book saying that his inspiration is the 3 Catholic rosaries known as joyful, sorrow, glorious. Perhaps some of you grew up in the Catholic tradition. I remember reciting these rosaries when someone passed away and what have you. And he says these produce in him a deep poetic stimulation of compassion. Contemplating Jesus' scourging, he feels a oneness with every beaten down person in the world. It is not religious masochism, he says, pointing out that the earliest crosses were adorned not with Christ in agony, but with jewels that symbolized, in place of unredeemable pain, the triumph of suffering transmuted. When he meditates this way, he says he feels a fullness, a wholeness. There's no longer any part of life that can't be embraced. I never knew this, because I grew up, of course, with the crucifixes with Jesus on the cross. And it's a very powerful symbol as it is, but it's focusing on the kind of painful moments of that. With thinking of a crucifix with jewels embedded in it, has a whole other connotation, right? And it gives us this opportunity to look at something, again, in a very different way. Now, where did I come up for the title of this talk? It actually goes back to the story of when Prince Siddhartha was achieving enlightenment. The story, I won't give the whole story of his path, but he essentially left home, left the palace, decided he was going to go on a spiritual quest to figure things out. And he had studied and meditated with many great masters. And he came to the conclusion that the path they were teaching didn't lead to the result that he was seeking. So he decided to sit under the Bodhi tree in India. There still is a tree and a huge monument there to the Buddha in Bodh Gaya. And he decided he would achieve liberation, freedom from all that is sort of holding us back in that very sitting. He would make that happen. And the story is that at various moments he was confronted with things that are kind of like his own inner demons. And I'm going to read the story of what happened in particular at one point. This one sort of a personification of our negative states of mind called Mara. It said, so Mara and his evil forces tried everything to disturb Siddhartha. They produced a fearful storm and hurled lightning bolts down around him. They churned up a great wind until everything around seemed ready to crash down. But beneath the branches of the tree, everything remained calm, protected by the force of Siddhartha's meditation. Mara saw that the storm had no effect, so he turned to his troops and shouted, "Attack!" The whole horde of evil spirits, demons, and nightmare shapes turned against Siddhartha. They ran towards him wildly, yelling blood-curdling screams. They shot poisoned arrows of hate at him. But as these arrows flew towards the prince, they turned into lotus petals and fell harmlessly at his feet. Nothing could disturb the peace of his meditation. Okay, so how do we get to a place where we can actually be peaceful and unaffected by the arrows that are thrown at us every day? You know, there's another sutra that I want to quote, or another story from the Buddha. It goes back to the Salata Sutra. Salata actually means arrow. And in this sutra, the Buddha is essentially talking about two arrows. The very first arrow is the arrow that we experience throughout our days, right? The arrow of pain, of difficulty, people saying things about us or doing things that we don't like. You know, those arrows we have to face. And of course, even physically, we have a lot of things that we deal with these bodies. The arrow of aging, the arrow of illness, even the arrow of death. There's a second arrow. And that's the sort of mental component, the way in which we look at the first arrow. That's what we have a bit more control over. In the Salata Sutra, this is what Buddha says when he's asked about the difference between those who know how to work with the first arrow versus those who create a second arrow. He says, the Blessed One said, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed, run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, physical and mental, just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow and right afterward were to shoot him with another one, so that, good, okay, so that he would feel the pains of two arrows. In the same way, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught, so he feels two pains, physical and mental. This is the idea behind this, is that when things do happen to us, we're not denying the reality of that experience. But how many times do we torture ourselves with a self-created second arrow? How many times do we layer on top of our own pain so much more anguish and suffering that is not really necessary? In the Zen Buddhist tradition, they often talk about how pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And in that way, they're talking about the physical pains that we experience, the difficulties, but the mental suffering on top of it is entirely optional. It depends upon how we look at it. And I was kind of saddened this week to hear of the death of Alexei Navalny in Russia. But he exemplifies for me what a spirit of this positive thinking in the face of suffering and difficulty looks like at an extreme degree, right? Because he was willing even to go back into Russia after having been poisoned, practically brought to his death, in order to kind of demonstrate a courage and an ability to stay determined in the face of whatever happened to him. They even showed that video that was like his final appearance before he passed away, and his spirit was still unchanged. He still had this joy of life that was there while being in a prison in Siberia, right? You know, I can't even imagine what that kind of pain and suffering is like. So we know that this works because we see it in our world, and we see it in our spiritual leaders, we see it in many people, and we think somehow, well, but I can't be like that. You know, I can't possibly be that strong, that courageous. But we can. So again, how do we do that? In Tibetan Buddhism, we work with a technique that in Tibetan it's called Lojong. Lo means mind, Jong means training or transformation. And it's kind of all of what Buddhism is about. And as I understand Centers for Spiritual Living, it's very much what Ernest Holmes had in mind when he was coming up with the idea of working with our thoughts, working with changing our minds, the sort of science of mind that he put forth. So I don't think there's huge differences. It's just different techniques that are taught in different traditions. In the Lojong teachings, in Tibetan Buddhism, we are primarily working with the concept of transforming our suffering into something that increases our good qualities, kind of grows more flowers, kind of creates more internal beauty. It's not going to change the external situation necessarily. And certainly if there are times when you can change the external situation, nothing wrong with that, right? There's a great Indian Buddhist master, Shantideva, in one of his seminal works called The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. He's teaching on patience, and he says, if it's something that you can do something about, well, then your worry, your anguish, again, that second arrow stuff doesn't make any difference, really, because you just should put your energy into fixing it. So if it's something you can fix, then put your energy there. The second part of the verse says, if it's something you cannot remedy, you cannot fix, well, then your anguish, your worry, all of this is useless because it's something that you're railing against that is something you have to accept. So at some level, we're talking about an initial sort of acceptance that this is part of life. We're all going to experience pain. Even again, the great spiritual masters of the past were not free of that. You know? Buddha, in terms of what he suffered even after attaining enlightenment, they say, there were these experiences of pain and difficulty. But it's a total mental transformation that allows us to be with all of that in a very different way. So in the thought transformation teachings, it's taught that we should primarily do two things initially. The first is we have to stop looking at the painful stuff as a problem. That's the very first step. If we see it as an opportunity, then we've already worked with our mind to some degree. We're not so resistant when pain enters into our life. When suffering confronts us, we say, oh, my old friend suffering, what do you have to teach me today? Kind of open to that opportunity. Now, my teacher, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, says there's a second thing that we need to do in addition to just framing it in that way, in terms of being kind of accepting of it, bringing it in, stop thinking of it as a problem. He says you should eventually get to the place where you look forward to your problems and like them in the same way that you like ice cream. That sounds pretty outrageous, right? When I first heard that instruction, I was like, oh my gosh. I like ice cream. I think he also said music to Jean's presence here. He said, the same way you like music or ice cream, you should be looking forward to your problems in that way. Like, oh, good, I get to experience this. So it's kind of not just stopping seeing it as a problem, it's actually seeing it as a wonderful thing in your life. Again, I'm not saying I have this or that you should have this immediately upon hearing these words, but just be open to that idea. What would it be like to look forward to your problems in the way that you look forward to delicious dessert or beautiful music, what have you? So, what we do in working with this is there are several techniques, and some of them I won't go into because they're perhaps a bit more grounded in Buddhist philosophy, which is different from other traditions. But the ones that I'm going to share with you are common, and I think can be used by any of you to work with these suffering experiences. So first, thinking that this is not a problem, this is something I get to work with. Maybe eventually I can learn to like these problems. We first start off as seeing that this is an opportunity to actually grow spiritually, to kind of find, in Buddhism we use the term refuge. And refuge is the idea that we find safe direction in our spiritual teachings. Now, all of you have spiritual teachings you subscribe to through this organization. When you are confronted with suffering, you should see it initially as, oh, this is my wake-up call. This is a chance for me to test my own spiritual strength, my own growth, to really see, what can I learn from this? How can this help me on my path? Is there something that I'm missing that I could gain from examining this, embracing it, actually working with it? That sets the stage for the remaining meditations that we do. But to just kind of first be reminded that this is what spiritual practice is. Many of my teachers in Tibetan Buddhism have essentially defined spiritual practice as working with your mind every moment of the day. course, that's a tall order, right? Most of us don't have the ability to kind of be with our mind, have that mindfulness, that awareness, to kind of see what thoughts are arising, to address what is negative and reduce it, to increase what is positive. That's really the goal of so much spiritual practice, not just in Buddhism, but in many traditions, is to really look at what is going on in our minds. How can we tend to the sort of garden of our minds and grow more flowers, grow more qualities with whatever we experience, not shutting anything out. Okay, so the second technique, after initially kind of bringing it in and saying, oh, this is my opportunity to test my own spiritual growth, is also to then look at the reality of pain and suffering in our own lives, to really learn to embrace that. Now in Buddhism, of course, the Buddha taught a path of eventually freeing ourselves from all of this. Again, I don't need to go into all of that detail, but this is where that kind of feeds into, is that we begin to accept that while this is something that we can work with, it's also something we'd like to be free from, inevitably. You know, suffering is kind of the stimulus for us to go deeper in regard to our spiritual practice, to see where is our own sense of liberation. And as I said, the Buddha still experienced some painful situations even after attaining enlightenment that from the outside looked like he was in great pain. But there was a peace on the inside, the same peace that he demonstrated when all the arrows were flying at him, that remained calm, remained intact, regardless of what was going on around him. So this is the impetus. When we see suffering, when we see pain, and we experience it ourselves, it reminds us that this is something that we have to develop a deeper quality in order to overcome. In Buddhism, again, it is said that you can overcome it in its entirety. I don't know. Again, different traditions teach different things. But we all have an ability at least to develop the strength and the courage to be able to endure what goes on in our lives. Just like, again, that picture of Navalny, being just joyful while talking to the camera days before, I think even the day before, he passed away in pretty dire situations. It's very inspiring to see that, right? The next technique that I want to mention is we often talk about overcoming our pride and developing humility. When we experience suffering, we can see our prideful mind often manifesting like, why is this happening to me? I don't deserve this. This is not something that I ordered, right? There was a wonderful book title by this Theravadan Buddhist teacher, Ajahn Brahm, called Who Ordered This Truckload of Dung? It's like when the truckload of dung shows up at your doorstep, you can go, who ordered this? I didn't order this. This isn't my order. That's not for me. Well, where's that coming from? It's coming from a sense of pride, right? That we feel somehow we're above it. We shouldn't be the ones experiencing this pain. I didn't order this. This isn't something that's part of my, repertoire. This is something for someone else. They misdelivered it. Well, they delivered it to you, the right address, okay? You got it, and you're the one that gets to own it and to clean it up or deal with it in whatever way you can. Well, this is a good way to practice the humility that recognizes that we're also subject to suffering. We're also subject to pain, subject to loss, subject to grief. It can be a real sort of leveler. They often say about how death is the great leveler, right? That kind of shows us that we're all in the same camp regardless of our particular status or what have you. But it's true with regard to any pain that we experience. And even during the COVID pandemic, when we had so many people passing away, and it was people of all shapes and sizes, right? All varieties of people. It was the great leveler, kind of showed us all what the reality is for ourselves. So, after we accept that that's our suffering, then we have to diminish that sense of pride and try to be humble in the face of this. Another technique is one that I touched on a little bit in a previous talk I gave, I think towards the end of last year, that had to do with working with suffering as we see it or experience it as a doorway for compassion. Of course, this is something, again, that even Brother David Standel-Rast mentioned in the quote that I shared with you earlier, and it's something that all spiritual traditions teach to some degree. Compassion is a thread that runs through all of them, right? It's taught and embraced as a very important value and quality that each of us has. So when we encounter suffering in our own lives, it is a doorway to see the suffering that is experienced by other beings, by other people as well. You know, that's a touchstone for us to be able to open our hearts to the reality that we're not alone in our suffering. This is what another state of mind that comes up that is probably related to our pride as well, is that we somehow think that I and my suffering am so much greater than anyone else dealing with their situations, right? But we don't need to look very far to see that there are many people suffering much worse than we are. Regardless of what it is that you're experiencing, there's always someone on the planet that's going through a more difficult time. So thoughts of compassion can well up if we allow them to. And we might begin with some self-compassion, try to see our own suffering in a more universal light and understanding it as part of our own condition. But then also trying to see that others are suffering at the same time. And this is going to lead into the final meditation that I want to share with you that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, where we actually try to use what we are experiencing as suffering as a portal to think about removing the suffering of others. So this last one is kind of a technique that we learn in Tibetan Buddhism to counteract what we call the self-centered mind. I don't know what it would be called in your spiritual tradition. Sometimes it's even there called self-cherishing. But the idea is that we have this sense of self-importance that is the focal point for so much of what we go through, so many second arrows that we inflict upon ourselves. It's the sense that I myself matter more than anyone else, and we tend to neglect the welfare of others. We see this pretty active in our world, and hopefully you can examine your own life and begin to be honestly accepting the way that it manifests in your life. But we have that vantage point of being kind of up above everyone else and thinking that our needs matter so much more than everyone else's. Now again, many of us have developed some compassion and an ability to get past some of that, but no doubt it still is there in some subtle way. This sense of self-centeredness, this idea that I have to be mainly concerned about my own welfare and let everyone else be concerned about theirs. Well, this is actually not how happiness actually comes about. If we look at the interconnection, interdependence, which is a word I think I use almost every time I talk here, we see that our welfare is very much dependent upon others. We don't live on an island completely separated and isolated from everyone else, but rather we are deeply connected to others. So we completely fly in the face of that reality every time that we hold this sense of self-cherishing, thinking that I'm the only one that matters. So this is one of the main targets that we try to overcome in this technique that I'm going to teach you, explain to you. The technique in Tibetan Buddhism is called Tonglen, T-O-N-G-L-E-N, kind of two words. Tong actually means to give, and Len means to take. But the meditation is done in a reverse order. So let me explain how you would do this in terms of a particular suffering that you're having. Say you do get a really bad flu or cold or something, you're miserable, you're lying there in your bed, and all you can think about is poor me and how awful that I'm suffering and what have you. With some of the initial thoughts that I mentioned, you begin to open your heart to the reality that you're not the only one who's bedridden at this time on this planet, right? You can at least begin to think about those beings who are going through exactly what you're doing, that are having to face being congested and miserable and coughing and feverish and body aches, all of that sort of stuff that happens, right? And you can begin to think, first an initial thought of, wouldn't it be wonderful if through my having to endure this, they could be free from that. It's kind of the initial seed that we plant of kind of thinking that our suffering isn't meaningless, and our suffering isn't increasing our sense of self-importance and self-cherishing. It's actually opening the doorway for me to think, could others possibly be liberated from their suffering simply by me enduring what I have to endure? It doesn't change the level of your suffering, right? You're not going to suffer worse because of this. You're just going to transmute your suffering into the beautiful thought of, wouldn't it be wonderful if they could be free of that? Because you know what it's like for them to be experiencing it, because you're experiencing it now. That's just an initial sort of putting the toe in the water to kind of take on that attitude of, wouldn't it be just amazing if we could do that for others? Whoever they are. It doesn't matter whether they're somebody you would normally despise in society or whatever. If they're enduring that pain, well, wouldn't it be good to have that removed from them? Just because there's pain, there's suffering. You don't have to have any kind of heart connection to that person. You just don't want them to suffer in the same way that you don't want to suffer. So then once you develop these sorts of thoughts that you're entertaining the idea of being about removing the suffering of others, you can begin to do a little visualization meditation where you can think about those beings who are enduring the similar thing that you're going through. You don't know them, you don't know their faces, but you can imagine them in the space in front of you. You can even go beyond that to think about others who are enduring difficulties and pain. We can see it on the news. You just turn on, and see what's going on in Gaza, see what's going on in Ukraine. All these places where we can see suffering in the world. Depending on how big you feel your heart can get, you can think about as many of those beings as possible. And you begin to generate compassion towards them. First feeling their pain, their suffering, and starting with the wish, how wonderful it would be if they were free of that. And then secondly, entertaining the idea of, may they be free from that. They say this is stronger because it's kind of like you're the ruler of a kingdom and you're saying through decree, may this happen, may this actually come to pass. The third is to kind of say, well, and I'm going to do what I can to develop some courageous compassion to help that happen, to make that happen. And this is that important step where it goes, and it is a bit of your own vulnerability, to Deborah's quote that she shared from Brene Brown. It does mean that you are opening yourself up, in a sense, to wanting to remove that suffering, to take that even upon yourself. Now, will it change the suffering that you're going to experience? Probably not. You're still going to be there with your flu, feeling the symptoms that you're going through, but you're going to develop this willingness to take the suffering away from others. That's the first part of the meditation, is what we call the taking away the suffering of others, and to kind of feel that we're bringing it into ourselves. And you can use any sort of visualization that you wish. Oftentimes they encourage it to be kind of something unpleasant, so that you kind of get the idea that you are taking on all this pain and difficulty. You might visualize it as very thick, hot smoke that's very kind of uncomfortable to inhale, but you can bring it in even with the breath and bring it down to your heart with this willingness to kind of take away the suffering of others. And then think that at your heart, it doesn't just kind of infect you and become some huge mass of suffering within you. It actually is destroying instantly that self-centeredness, that tendency that we have to think only about ourselves. And that's kind of the magic of this, is that we're not kind of taking all this suffering and kind of thinking, oh, then I become even worse, I get a flu and I die and all this horrible stuff happens. It's rather, I'm going to take all that and I'm going to put it as sort of, maybe it's a good analogy back to the arrow. I'm going to bring this kind of in as an arrow that pierces and destroys that tendency that I have to be very selfish and to not think of others. So it's kind of the exact target of what we're trying to do here, to get at what keeps us from really being open to the suffering of others, embracing the suffering of others as something that we need to not shut out, but rather keep our hearts very open to, and even have the wish to remove it. That's the whole first part of the meditation. And you can do it very quickly, kind of bringing it all in one fell swoop, and think that it destroys this tendency of self-centeredness. But you can also do it very gradually if you're feeling like you need something that's a little smoother, not quite as, violent as bringing something in all in one fell swoop. Then we turn to the giving side of it, which is another kind of beautiful part of this meditation. And that's where we think about the fact that even though we've taken away the suffering from those beings, again, whoever it is you're working with, whatever dimension of beings you want to embrace and take in, you now look at those beings and you recognize, well, I've taken away their suffering, but I haven't really brought them to kind of the apex of their happiness, the fullness of their being, right? So there you start focusing on what we call loving kindness or love, and you generate 3 thoughts towards them again. How wonderful it would be if these beings had every happiness and all the causes of happiness, to the complete fulfillment of their being, all the way to that. How wonderful. Secondly, just like that ruler, you're going to say, and may this be so. May this happen. May they have happiness and the causes of happiness. And thirdly, you're going to say, and I will do this for them. I will help them to achieve that state of well-being. Again, it keeps you in that active mode. Or again, it's a little vulnerable too, because here what we're going to do is we're actually going to give everything that we have that brings us happiness away to them. So what you can do with this in the meditation or visualization that I usually encourage you to do is to kind of think that at your heart, where this kind of mass of self-centeredness was, is now this beautiful jewel. Or you can think of it as a beautiful flower, if you wish. It's something that represents your whole inner beauty and everything that is good at the core of your being. You can infuse that with everything that you have in your life, the friends you have, the possessions you have, all the positive energy you've created through all the things you've done, all that kind of brought in as a brilliant white light that you're going to then start to send out to these beings. And when it reaches them, it's no longer what it was for you, it becomes exactly what they need to bring them to happiness, to bring them to the fulfillment of their being. So, again, you can do this in a very brief way, bringing it all that in and sending it all out. And you can do this with the exhalation, if you wish, with the breath, and then it immediately becomes that for these other beings. Or you can do it in a very gradual way, sending a little bit out each time, and it brings them further and further on their path to happiness. On this meditation, it's sometimes good to maybe start with 1 or 2 people, and you can even start with yourself. Self-compassion and self-love is a part of the spiritual path, right? And if you need that kind of attention, then by all means, work there initially. Visualize yourself in your current situation, dealing with what you're dealing with, and see yourself as a suffering being and want that for yourself initially. And then you can begin to open up to others. But if you do get really adventurous and want to take on like the whole world, that's a pretty big visualization to begin with. And of course, it makes our heart so much bigger when we're doing that. Well, then that's great if you can get to that place. But the whole idea is to kind of develop within yourself these amazing qualities of compassion and loving kindness towards beings. And then you will act from that place. Then you will actually be out in the world from that vantage point. I remember when I first learned this technique, there was a friend of mine who was in hospice in San Francisco, and I sat by his bedside doing this silently. Just didn't have to announce it to the world. It's actually kind of nice to just engage in the practice on your own without any advertisement or what have you. But one of my friends was there, and he said, after we left, he said, "Oh, you were really quiet during your time there with Elliot, our friend." And he said, "What were you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I was doing this practice called Tonglen." And I explained it to him, and he said, "Sounds awful." So if you're having that thought that it kind of sounds a little awful, well, again, maybe you can work with that and just see, well, where's that coming from? What is going on that makes you somewhat resistant to this idea of opening up to taking in suffering? So, again, I hope there's some clarity in what I've shared. This whole practice, again, of taking and giving, as it's often called in English, is about taking the suffering of another and giving away your happiness. I might remind you, even if you do have those thoughts of like, oh, it sounds awful, maybe I couldn't do this, I would guess that most of you, certainly those of you who have been a parent when you had a sick child, no doubt you sat at the bedside of that sick child and probably held those kinds of thoughts, right? Oh, I wish I could take away their illness so that they wouldn't be suffering so, and bring that on myself. And I wish I could give them all well-being and happiness so that they could just be very content. And we would willingly do it for our child, right? And some of us, certainly, if we don't have children, might do that for another loved one, a pet, a partner, a parent, right? We would see that there's the potential for our hearts to open. But there are blocks when it goes outside of our little comfort zone. One of my friends says, you never grow unless you get out of your comfort zone, unless you experience some discomfort. Maybe that's the divine discomfort we're talking about here, right? When we're actually able to take on things that are uncomfortable for us. It's uncomfortable to think about the person who we find, like the one we'd want to vote off the planet if we had a chance, right? You know, get them off the planet. What would it be like to think about taking on their suffering, their pain? That's a pretty tall order. But again, you work with it gradually, work with it in a comfortable way, but always pushing the envelope, taking in a little more discomfort. And I have no doubt that some of these great beings who use these techniques or similar techniques, people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Pope Francis, so many other people in this world, who've developed these amazing hearts, that they did it in this way of gradually opening up their heart more and more and more to the suffering of others, to the situation of others. And we can do that too. There's nothing stopping you other than your own mental thoughts, perhaps again your own second arrows that you're creating. We have to kind of recognize those first arrows that come in are an amazing opportunity for us to move in this direction, to work with our pain, our difficulty, to transform it in that way. I might mention too that it is said that you should work with probably smaller moments of pain first before like you tackle the really big ones, but again, I think that may be somewhat self-evident. I'm going to share a little quote with you from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who was the head of our organization. He passed away just about a year ago, but his teachings are still here and so wonderful. He says, in these difficult and dangerous times, there is no better armor, no better protection than the practice of thought transformation. By doing these practices and not allowing yourself to be irritated by problems, you are suddenly released from all your problems, like an army dropping its weapons. It's so funny that I had that quote prepared, and then Deborah shared a similar quote from Brene Brown. So again, I wish you luck with all of this. Know that this technique is out there in many books. Pema Chodron is a wonderful teacher of this, Tibetan Buddhist American nun, and she has a lot of good instruction on how to work with this. But I think it's something that is of value, and I hope my sharing it with you today gives you an opportunity to use it. So thank you all. Appreciate it.